So let's look at the question for that concept clip regarding political socialization. Number one, the process by which people acquire their political opinions, beliefs, and values. So the process by which they acquire those political beliefs, that it should help you that, the concept clip is defined here. So that is political socialization. But if you wanted a refresher, you could move back to the top and you say, oh, well, what is that? Well, it has the term opinion in it, and it's just held by ordinary citizens that express political ideology. Let's see, where is that? A general belief about the role and purpose of government. And I don't think the last one was even an option. That's the wrong one. So yeah, political transference wasn't even an option. So number two, these agents are those that citizens interact with and closely and regularly and include family, school, and religion and have an impact early in life, including childhood. Those are your primary agents, or your family, church/religion, or school. So an example of school would be my son came home from, I want to say, kindergarten one year, and he was crying, and being the protective mother that I was, I got really upset, and I was asking questions, as many as I could, to figure out why he was so upset leaving school. And as it turned out, his teacher had discussed, the upcoming Martin Luther King holiday, and then had advised that, and I'm sure my son probably asked because he had been one of those before he turned into a teenager. She explained that he was shot, and he was really upset about it. So even those moments that you think that they won't remember do influence them and impact them very much so. So that's why school does have such a great impact on you as far as your political beliefs, especially, given that most of the time are going to say the pledge of allegiance to the flag, and then discuss elections as well and hold mock elections. And anyway, you get used to the process of political socialization in school. What is the most important agent of socialization in which citizens are first exposed to political events and ideas? That would be your family, and your family is associated with your party identification. So that might be a question. Hopefully we'll see it somewhere later on, but if not, know that family equals political. And I didn't believe that. I said, what is my political science teacher talking about when he first brought this concept up? Like, don't judge me. Don't tell me that I'm a conformist and I just do whatever my parents say. And then I started thinking about my political beliefs, and I said, yeah, he might be right. There might be something there. So they talk about as young adults in high school, and then later on in college, you start questioning, your beliefs, and are are your parents' beliefs your own? And maybe you start looking at things from a different perspective. And then number 4, which agent of socialization is responsible for setting the national agenda, signaling to Americans that an issue is important and should be taken up by the government? So that is the media, and they will do that for you. So that's a secondary agent of socialization. And you'll learn that term signaling in chapter 10 with the media. It's one of the 4 functions that the media has. And we also know the media to be the 4th branch of our government. It just, it serves as a checks and balance on our government. It's not, in fact, the 4th branch, but we don't have 4 branches. We just have the 3. But anyway, it's regarded as that because it is very important in serving as a check and balance on some of our government. All right, number 5, which of the following are secondary agents of socialization having an impact on citizens' political socialization later in life? Secondary agents, and those include media, peers, and political events. So all of those options would be. And a good way to remember primary versus secondary agents is know your primary, family, church, and school, and also know that they use the term religion, and those are interchangeable, and you just have to know that going into the test. I've had people just, well, it didn't say church, Professor Green. Well, it said, don't get tied up on technicalities like that. All right, so two defining characteristics, and this is important to know, is that we learn as children, what we learn as children stays with us as adults, and then the effects of socialization are cumulative. Okay, and this just goes through, and it serves to reference that video if you in fact don't want to watch it again. So, Vance Party, that's why the arrow is pointing here. And you learn about political figures like Martin Luther King and Abraham Lincoln. They hold mock elections, and then they pledge allegiance to the flag. And then your religion also sometimes will focus in on. So I don't know that I really paid attention to any of that. My mind was usually occupied elsewhere. But know those three primary agents. Know your secondary agents as well: peers, media, leaders, and events. So political events, political leaders, peers, or friends. With age, additional socializing agents. Okay, so now we're going to look at public policy as far as how the public feels regarding national pride. So as you can see, the question is, how proud are you of the way democracy works in America? And this is the percent saying they're proud, and it starts around 2002 and goes through 2017. So as you can see, in 2002, right after 9/11, which was kind of a bonding experience for Americans, and you know, they didn't like what had happened to their country, so they kind of were rallying together, and there was a strong sense of nationality during that time. But as the years progressed, it just goes downward from there. So 2 years later, it's at 84%, so 6 points down. And then 10 years from that point, it's 10 points down, so 16 points down. And then it drops even lower, which is, I believe, 11 points from 74%. So to 63% in 2017. And so these were the Obama years, and this was around the election of President Trump. You had an 11-point drop. So unfortunately, Americans aren't feeling the sense of pride that they did back in 2002. And you would hope that Americans were comfortable with how their democracy is working, because if they don't believe that their democracy is working, it's going to be problematic for the nation. So you do have some partisan hostility at the moment, and party polarization. You see, however, that Joe Biden is running for the Democratic ticket, and I think that because he is more of a moderate, they're trying to attract some of President Trump's voters. And I know for a fact that a lot of Trump voters would go into open primaries and vote Biden rather than Sanders. So they did that strategically because they would have. The learning objective is to demonstrate comprehension of Americans' opinions about politics. We can do that by looking at different frames of reference that we utilize and determine how. So these reference points include partisanship, which party we identify with, ideological leanings, what we believe the role and purpose of government to be, so how we lean if we don't identify with the party, and then group attachments. Do certain groups that you belong to lean certain ways, and do they how you think politically? So these frames of reference will provide an indication of how Americans think politically, and then form a basis for common cause. So party identification is another key term. It's the emotional attachment, and it's not the formal membership to a political party. So you just have to have some sort of emotional attachment to a party. You don't have to be formally registered as a Democrat. Um, to go along with that, I just wanted to make one note. Do not confuse party identification with party ideology. I've seen students do that in the past. Party ideology is when you the government to have a specific role and purpose. It's not the emotional loyalty or attachment to a party. Be sure to distinguish between those two. And one thing you need to note about party identification, once you've identified with a party, you generally stick with that party unless there's some sort of major upheaval. Now, we've talked in the past during our chapter 3 with federalism. We talked about dual federalism. That was had been the norm, and then we got into cooperative federalism. So there was a realignment election. So with that realignment, there was a critical issue, how we were going to address the economy. There was a critical election, and FDR ended up winning. And then finally, there was enduring change. 3 decades or so of, at least 3 decades of this party maintaining control. So there was a shift in thought as to which party should be in control. And so it clearly went from being Republican to Democrat. It's very rare that that happens, however. You can have de-alignments as well, and that's when people don't identify party. And I would argue that's almost occurring today, especially if you move back to this national pride and how democracy works. Americans aren't identifying here and agreeing that democracy works at a higher rate because they're dissatisfied with some of the things that are going on. And I think that's a result of both parties. Next, you do realize that party identification can lead to selective pursuit. So that, for instance, could be you wanting to have a confirmation bias and you wanting to, so you like to hear what you think, so you want to hear more people reinforce your political views, and so you're going to what you hear from others based on your beliefs. And then finally, partisanship clearly divides American opinion in the everyday, and we see that on social media. I know my family has certain people that don't talk to each other anymore. Again, my family is very political, and you'll see in an upcoming short video that I'm going to include that it mentions how conservatives feel on certain issues and how liberals feel on certain issues. And they contrast greatly in some areas. Not all areas, but some. So that's where you're going to have some of these hang-ups as far as communication goes. And I've often said that we may need arbitrators in elected office, someone to act on behalf of both parties and to communicate to ensure that we have bipartisan efforts going forward and advancing the needs of our nation. Dash 1, it's referencing party identification. Over to the right, you see the elephant, which is representative of the mascot for the Republicans, and then you have the donkey, which is representative of the Democrats. And then this little eye or eagle represents, and I don't know if that's really the case or not, but you're just saying that the independents don't really have their own mascot, or there's so many different types of independents out there that they couldn't possibly have a mascot. So there's no telling what the independent mascot is. So the next thing we want to look at is party identification as far as Americans go, who the majority of Americans identify with. So as you can see, primarily the largest number that we're seeing is Democratic. So 32% say that they're Democrats, and then 22% Republicans. You also have indicators that 18% are leaning Democrat and 13% are leaning Republican. So it would appear that you have more people who favor the Democratic or Liberal Party than the Conservative or Republican Party. And then you have independents here. And, you know, I think sometimes that these guys sometimes work together. I'm wondering what's going to happen with this election, and if these guys might create an issue. I'm not sure just yet, but I'm going to have to watch how this election plays out, because of the candidates this time, and it's just so I expect anything at this point with 20. You know, just expect anything. So and these identify the mascots of each parties. You have the Republican Party, you have the Democratic Party, the donkey representing the mascot for the Democratic Party, the Republican having an elephant represent them, and then this eye is for an independent, but there's really what mascots independents hold, because independents, while they may say they're independent, they're not grouped together because a lot of them don't share the same beliefs. They're not collectively a party. So once you have a party established at that point, maybe you would go about identifying a mascot for your party. All right, partisanship and policy priorities. So these are important to look at. So this is really the reason why you have parties. There are certain things that the Republican Party or conservatives hold dear, and there's that your Liberal or Democratic Party hold dear. So as you can see, the 62% and the 72% are indicative of Democratic feelings towards climate change and assisting the poor. They feel very strongly on those issues. So that's why I included this blue box, because that represents those two issues that are Democratic in nature. And then on your right, you have the conservative groups. 63% of conservatives and 67% of conservatives believe deficit and strengthening military. So you have priorities, and one relates more to money and protection of your nation, and then your Democrats, they're focusing more on the people and assisting with addressing climate change. I would argue with Biden being the candidate for the Democratic ticket that he appeals to conservatives, because he in fact has Medicare, Medicaid in the past, and he's also responsible for some of the more Republican crime bill of 1994. So it's very confusing to see him running on the Democratic ticket, because he's generally not someone that you would typically believe to be of that ideology. As far as party loyalties in the states, the blues represent your Democratic states: Washington, Oregon, California. All of these are your West Coast states, identify as Democratic, and then your East Coast states identify Democratic, and then some states identify as Democratic. You also have New Mexico and Colorado identifying as Democratic. These other Republican states, the Reds, Mississippi, Alabama, South Carolina, Oklahoma, Kansas, Nebraska, North Dakota, Montana, Wyoming, Idaho, and Utah, and Alaska. Hawaii identifies as a Democratic state, so surprise there. And the purple states are your battleground states. They include Texas, and Texas has been known to be politically conservative, but you also have an increasing Hispanic population. And in recent elections, the 2018 midterm, you saw some changes, and you saw the Senate election between Beto O'Rourke and Ted Cruz coming way closer than the pollsters predicted. So they're thinking that Texas could potentially swing, but that's all dependent on whether people get out and vote and the different demographics who are actually, out there and can vote, do register to vote, and then actually go participate and vote. All right, the next few slides actually are going to deal with political ideology. And again, that's the general belief about the role and purpose of government. It's definitely not party identification or one's loyalty or emotional attachment to a party. Those are two different. So it notes that you can have economic liberals and you can have economic conservatives. You can have cultural liberals and you can have cultural conservatives. And this is looking at the economic scale and the social scale. So that's what this is representative of. I'm going to ask you guys to take this. You don't have to, but it's a political compass quiz. You can go to politicalcompass.org and take it. All right, so this slide looks at political ideology and the different variations of where someone could land as an economic liberal or as an economic conservative. So if you are an economic liberal, you are more than likely going to land in the liberal sector or the democratic sector, also, which is also true of these are the two that you would identify with if you were this category after taking the quiz. If you're an economic conservative or if you are a cultural conservative, this is the group that you end up in. If you are a populist, this is a term they say is used to describe those who believe the government should do more to assist people who have difficulty with economic needs and who look to government to uphold traditional values. So look at these individuals. It's Mao Zedong, Fidel Castro, Robert Mugabe from Zimbabwe, and Joseph Stalin. So they're more authoritarian type figures, but they were believers in communism. So anyway, you can also have your libertarians, and they're your hands-off. Government, we don't want you involved in anything. Regulating us as far as social issues, marijuana consumption, etc. And we don't want the government spending too much on everyone and taxing us. Taxes are terrible in the minds of a libertarian. Craig Benzine does a really good job of summing up these people. I'm not going to include this clip in this actual footage, but I'm going to attach it as a separate link in only 5 minutes of it. So anyway, you'll get to see how Craig Benzine describes some conservatives, some libertarians, populists versus, so you'll get to see the makeup of some of the individuals involved there and how they identify with their political ideologies. So next we look at group orientation. That's one of the three individuals identify with their different political. So 6 different ones include your economic class, the region in which you are living from, your race and ethnicity, your gender, and then your generation and your age. Impact how your views are on the scale, on the economic scale, and on the social scale as well. So if you are culturally conservative, religion might impact your ideology. If you are socially liberal, then your class might determine your ideology. Or if you're very wealthy, your economic class might determine your ideology as well. So if you fall on the right, and you're wealthier, then you obviously are going to identify as conservative because they're going to keep your taxes lower for the wealthier, because we've always had what has been a trickle-down economic system. As to whether or not the trickle-down system works or not, a lot of people would suggest that the answer is no. But anyway, I'll save that for your economics class. So the region in which you live. So we looked at the identification. So we knew that the West Coast identified as Democratic, your Upper East Coast, and then some of your Great Lakes states, as well as New Mexico and I believe Colorado. Then you had, Mississippi, Alabama, and a few others that identify as red states almost always. And then you had battleground states like Texas, for instance, that can go blue or red in election. Yes, your region can sometimes indicate how you're going to identify in regard to your ideology. Race and ethnicity are important. Generally, your minorities identify more with your liberals than they would with your, and then generations and age. Those are important too, because you're older, the boomer generation, the younger, the youth tend to vote. Yes, all of these factor in to how you view the role and purpose of government. As the impact of group loyalties is diminished with one group is offset by identification with others. So if one of these is more important than the others, that might determine where you're going political compass scale that I really hope you guys take. And I think there are points involved for that. So let me figure that out. Definitely ask about it if I haven't made it known. All right, so religion and politics, a bar graph where they're saying the percentage of regular churchgoers tend to vote Republican. Non-regular churchgoers, they'll vote at a 40%, 41% rate. So it's more likely if you're a regular churchgoer that you're going to vote conservatively. It said religion emerged as a political force in the 1970s. And today, religious observance and partisanship are closely connected. Regularly are far more likely to vote Republican. All right, finally, we're going to summarize the relationship between public opinion and public policy. So it says overseers disagree about how much public policy or public opinion affects policy and how much it should affect policy. And then they talk about your different views of how your elected officials view their roles. Should they take it as a delegate role or a delegate view? And in that role, they would say, well, we need to ask our constituents what to do. And generally, your House members who are up for re-election every 2 years are going to go about that policy. They're going to adopt a delegate point of view. They're going to have their staffers answer every call that they get from their constituents, follow up on everything, make sure their constituents are happy because that means they're up for re-election. And unless they've really got an interest group that's helping them out, they're going to have to somehow maintain their constituent base. Otherwise, they're not going to get reelected and they'll lose their federal government benefits and be out without a job and be in the poorhouse, etc. For government officials. Or you have the opposite. The person or the governmental elected official can take a trustee view, and that's when they believe that the public should trust their opinion. And so they'll take the constituents' ideas and concerns into account, but they will exercise judgment for what best serves their interest. So when we talked about the Parkland shooting earlier and how the majority wanted a ban on assault rifles at that point, almost 2/3 of Americans support assault rifles, and then 90% wanted stiffer background checks. You have Republicans in office. One of their main supporters is the NRA. And so that's, where they get a lot of their money as far as campaigning. So on a nationwide level, gun control really wasn't addressed at the level that that the American public thought that it should have been. Now, In a few states, there were changes that helped appease those wanting change to a small degree. I think that this is something that eventually will become a bigger issue. But right now, we've got a whole host of issues that we're trying to deal with. So there are limits to the public's influence, partially due in part to the public itself. We hold contradictions. Many of us have a weak understanding of the issues, and even mastery of the issues isn't necessary for an opinion to be of value, but a weak understanding of it can make it difficult for policymakers. So the example they gave was regarding taxation, and most everyone thought that their taxes were high, but when they asked whether they would cuts to Social Security, defense, and other costly spending programs, the majority said no. When they were asked what would they cut, they suggested foreign aid. Unfortunately, the reality of that is not realistic. It only amounts to 1% of the federal budget, so that wouldn't even come close to giving them the money needed to allow for the tax cuts that they wanted. His last statement, the author's last statement in this paragraph, is poll after poll over the past decades has shown that citizens are not well informed about politics, and some are badly misinformed. So unfortunately, that's problematic. So public influence necessarily count on the public to tell the government what to do. And so they have their own committees that investigate certain things, and a lot of times they look to the committees, to determine how they're going to take a certain course of action. Now, it says there's also limits as a result of the leaders' efforts to influence the public opinion. So, unfortunately, leaders don't always lead us in the right direction. And he talks about, Noah Chomsky talks about manufactured consent, and one of the examples that he provides is the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003. And for those of you who don't remember, they came up with this idea that there were weapons of mass destruction, and there was no such thing. So the Iraq War, in retrospect, has been seen as one of the most disastrous wars that the United States has ever been in, and that's agreed from both sides, both conservatives and the liberals, for the most part. But it said, although Americans had been hearing about Saddam Hussein for years and concluded he was a tyrant, they were unsure of whether an attack on Iraq made sense, and the polls at that time indicated that Americans preferred to have UN inspectors look at the weapons program before an invasion was made. But regardless, 70% of Americans agreed to the backing of the Iraq War. So he went ahead with that war, and now, it ends up kind of making the United States the aggressor in this instance. As far as public opinion goes, there are boundaries that the government cannot cross, and they must stay within. And the author, Thomas Patterson, notes that one of those is FDR's Social Security program, and he notes, and I highlighted it for you, that no damn politician can ever stop my Social Security program. So he was fairly confident in the creation of that program. And I believe that the public is with him on that, and will continue to be with him on that, although I've heard rumblings from the Democratic Party, Biden, who's more of a moderate conservative, speak to that. And also, that is a conservative talking point. Regardless, the public will not support that, in my opinion. I would have to see a lot more information indicating that the public was willing to scrap Social Security, and I haven't seen it yet. And The author goes on to note that sweeping changes in public opinion invariably lead to lasting and substantial changes in the direction of national policy. He talks of the shift with FDR's New Deal after the Great Depression. And then in the 70s, the American public began to question the scope of the government and federal government power and its spending. Of course, that was right at the end of the Vietnam War. So, and they had just released the Pentagon Papers, so they knew that we had been in a war for some time and that maybe that war wasn't necessary, or our being there wasn't going to result in anything. It just wasn't a winnable war. So they viewed the federal government as potentially overspending, and so they wanted policy changes, tax cuts, and then tightening of eligibility requirements for welfare. 1990s, you had tougher crime laws and sentencing laws that were passed also. So there are certain boundaries that must not be crossed, and then there are other boundaries that the public can set as well. So also with regard to boundaries of action, abrupt changes on an issue can lead to boundaries of acceptable action. So at one point you had Republicans in favor of free trade, yet when President Trump started to speak of, anti-free trade policies, they all shifted their opinion then. So at that point, that led to changes within their ideology. And also, congressional representatives, they're just going to pay close attention to public policy. So they'll shift wherever they have to stay in office, especially with regard to things like immigration. So whatever is popular and a hot button topic at that moment, if they know that that's going to explode, then they're going to take a firm stance on that and make it part of their campaign. So that ends it for chapter 6. I'm sorry this was later than I thought it would be. It's more difficult to create these videos than I like, and I'm one of those people that doesn't like a lot of error. So when I speak, I'll go back and try to make it sound better. Or anyway, I hope to get better at this. But last semester I was just doing it live, and that was really a lot easier. And I could talk to you guys and interact with you guys more so than I'm able to right now. The only time I'm going to interact with you is if you send an email to me, and I encourage you to do that. And I'm thankful that some of you have. But if you ever have questions or concerns, definitely let me know. Anyway, the next thing that you'll be getting is a review, and I can either have that live or I can present it in probably a document. It's just really up to you. And if I do have it live, I will record it for anyone else who would like to listen. Otherwise, I'm just going to put it probably in a study guide format. So if you guys want to, if you feel strongly on the issue either way, let me know, and then I'll go with whatever I'm hearing the most of. All right, you guys will be fine, especially after we go over the review. I know it's a lot of information, but I'll help you narrow down that information so that you're comfortable in taking this test. All right, take care, guys.